explore the history within regards to the country of Macedonia, the history within regards to the famous rabbis, famous personalities of yesteryear. This is a special edition, and we've covered other countries also, but I thought today we will speak about Macedonia itself, another country that we've spoken about on various occasions before. We mentioned many of the famous rabbis from over there. So you could say Macedonia, North Macedonia. It stretches back 2,000 years ago, the history does, beginning, I think, from Roman antiquity. Jews would arrive in the region. Now, I think following the Holocaust and immigration, especially to Israel, around 200 Jews, I think currently or in recent times, will remain in North Macedonia, in the capital of Skopje, and a few also in Stip, respectively, and Bitola. So today we're going to explore about the history within regards to it. Now, the first Jews that would arrive in the area now known, obviously, as North Macedonia, was during Roman times when Jews fled persecution in the Roman territories, and the presence of Jews in North Macedonia will be, let's say, attested by Agrippa's letter to Caligula. Now, Herod Agrippa the First, let's just say this. So, I think at Stobi in 165 AD, Tiberius Polycharmus, who, let's say, was a designated father of the synagogue, converted his villa into a synagogue containing a prayer hall, let's say a dining hall also, a portico reserving the upper story of the complex for his residents and that of his successors. I think it was very impressive, informative inscription. Let's say, arguably, some would say, one of the most essential one found to date in diaspora synagogue. The remnants, I think, of the Jewish synagogue excavated in Stobi date back to that period, and the conclusion that a developed Jewish community existed in that specific place in itself those days is based on those findings. Now let's look at medieval times now over here. Obviously it would persist in North Macedonia after Roman rule, and the population consisted until the 14th and 15th century primarily of Romaniote Jews, respectively. The First Crusade devastated the Jewish population in Pelagonia and Skopje. However, the Jews in North Macedonia would continue to have prominent members of their communities. For instance, there was someone named Leo II Monk. He was a philosopher who converted to Christianity and succeeded Theopluxus of Ohrid as Archbishop of Ohrid from 1108 to 1120. So I don't know if he was Jewish originally or not. So obviously we're not gonna, so we're not gonna celebrate that obviously over here, because this is, we don't obviously like seeing that people left Judaism and let's say went to another religion over there. So just say that from the outset. Apparently he was originally a Romanite Jew, but I think he would convert to Orthodox Christianity very, very sadly over here. So I'll say that on the outset over here. So that was the name of Leo II Mang. So let's just say he was originally a prominent member, but unfortunately this actually happened. He was a philosopher also. I think a leading Jewish scholar at the time that was born in Ohrid in 1328 was someone named Rabbi Judah Leon ben Moses Mosconi. I think he wrote commentaries stating that incorrect. So he was a commentator. He was, I think he was Bulgarian Romanite Jewish scholar, a Talmudist, itself. And very, very well known. I think he became a court physician to Peter, I think the fourth, if I'm not mistaken, at one point in time. He was into philosophy, both Hebrew and Arabic, and occupied himself within regards to Ibn Ezra's commentary in that point in time. And another, let's say, a famous Macedonian rabbi. We're going to speak about quite a lot of rabbis in today's video within regards to the history of Macedonia. So he would later, as we said, become the physician of the king of Majorca, where he assembled a vast library that was used by scholars for centuries to come. I think the first known synagogue in Skopje was the Beit Aaron synagogue, which was built in the year 1366, interesting enough. Now, Ottoman and Sephardic migrations. Now, the area's Jewish community remained small well into the Ottoman time period. I think obviously there was a major influx of Jews to the area coming with Spanish-Portuguese inquisitions, and Sultan Bayezid II of the Ottoman Jews Empire would welcome the Jewish people who were able to reach his territories. They were granted significant autonomy, various rights, including the right to buy real estate, to build synagogues, and to conduct trade through the Ottoman Empire. Wealthy merchant cities in the present of, let's just say, in North Macedonia, such as Skopje, monastery in Stip attracted many Jewish people. Jews prospered in the fields of trade, banking, medicine, law. Some would reach, let's say, positions of power. The Jewish cemetery in Bitola was established, I believe, in the year 1497, soon after the first Sephardic Jews had moved there. And the cemetery is the oldest Jewish cemetery in North Macedonia, if not in the entire Balkans area itself. I think there was a good relationship between the Jewish and non-Jewish communities. That's something also that we must point out over there. Now, let's talk about, there was an Italian traveler, I think, he wrote in 1560 that the Skop Jews exceeded other populations in number. In the 17th century, there were 3,000 Jews and 2 synagogues in Skopje. Beit Aaron and Beit Yaakov were the names of those synagogues. Now, in 1680, there was someone, there was, let's speak about Nathan of Gaza. He's also known as over here. He was known from that name. I think he lived between, if I'm not mistaken, 1643 to 1680. He was a theologian. He was an author that was born in Jerusalem, and he became a, let's just say, very, very closely connected to Shabtai Tzvi, the false Messiah over there, Nathan of Gaza. I think we've spoken about him on various occasions before. He would actually die in Sofia in Bulgaria. This was, I think, in the year 1680. He was a Sabbatinesium over there, and he did grow up in Jerusalem. Just to say something about him, I think he took on the surname Ashkenazi as a means of differentiating his family and himself from the largely Sephardic Jews of the empire. So it could be that that's his father. He had a father called Rabbi, I think he was a father, Rabbi Elisha Haim ben Jacob, who was an intellectual, and he would actually take on the name Ashkenazi to differentiate himself from that. Nathan of Gaza himself, I think, actually learned under Rabbi Yaakov Hagiz, who was a famous Talmudist, Gemara rabbi from the Sephardic Jewish family in Fez in Morocco, respectively. But I think, as we've said before, I think he was a Sabbatean, and let's just say he was a false prophet. And we mentioned him on various occasions before. We're not going to spend so much time speaking about him, but he was also a rabbi that was in Macedonia, let's just say. And all rabbis, I have to point out at that point in time, excommunicated Sabbateans, especially, I think, Nathan. I think this was the 9th of December, 1666, this was, warning everybody against harboring or even approaching him. And much has been spoken about him. And I'd recommend that maybe that's for another class over here. But he was Sabbateanism, and obviously there was a false Messiah, Shabtai Tzvi, who obviously caused a lot of destruction. And so we've spoken about this in of itself. Okay, now it's actually interesting. At one stage, Bitola itself had 9 synagogues. Skopje would have 3, and Stip would have 2 different synagogues over there, which is quite interesting. There was various different Jewish philosophers that were born and lived for a time in North Macedonia. There was a rabbi named Rabbi Shmuel de Medina, who we'll speak about now just for a minute. He happened to have been, I think, born in the year 1505 and passed away in 1589. I think we recorded a video about him. He was actually from Saloniki, and his teachers were famous rabbis, including the famous Rabbi Yosef Taitazak, another rabbi we spoke about before, also known as Maharitas, famous Kabbalist. Rabbi Levi ibn Chaviv was, I think, one of his rabbis, and he was close to rabbis of the caliber of Rabbi Isaac Adarbi, who was a rabbi in Salonika, Rabbi Yosef ibn Leb, and very much has been spoken within regards to him. I think, we've spoken about him before. I think he had connection with some of the rabbis in Tzfat, if I'm not mistaken, and I think, that's interesting. I think one of his grandchildren will be Rabbi Samuel Hayun, if I'm not mistaken. And he wrote many different workings and writings, and so, including the Ben Shmuel, which was printed in Mantua back in the year 1622. Anyone that's tuning in at the moment, we are looking at the history of Macedonian Jewry over here. So please, everyone, subscribe to the channel and keep up. We're exploring the history of Macedonia over here. We're speaking about Rabbi Shmuel de Medina. So over here, who was a famous Macedonian rabbi over here. Okay, so let's continue this class over here. I think the Skopje itself in 1689 was burned down, and there was a huge fire that actually broke out in Bitola in the 1863. Significantly, let's just say, it would diminish the Jewish population in North Macedonia in the two largest Jewish centers. Now, in the year 1689, the Jewish population of Skopje was 3,000 of the total 60,000 population. Very, very interesting enough. So now the Jewish community was almost entirely Sephardic and spoke Ladino at home. I think come with the 1895, the Alliance Israelite Universal established a school in Bitola, and more than 30% of the Macedonian Jews would speak French at this time. Remember, Alliance school system network we've spoken about before on this point of time will bring about more, let's say, liberalism, more openness to language, and it would have a religious effect also on the Macedonian Jewry. That's without a doubt. Jews also take part in the liberation movement against Ottoman rule. A great number of Macedonian Jewish people participated, I think, in the Linden Pribozhani uprising, and one of the most notable participants was someone named Rabbi, I don't know if it was a rabbi actually, someone named Raphael Moshe Kamhi, who would lead one of the rebel groups. It was he who took part in the early activities of the movement under the nickname Skadenberg, and he headed a unit in Debar during the uprising in the year 1903, which is very, very interesting. Mentes Kolomonos, Santo Oresti, the Musin brothers, and Avram Nissan are other known participants, let's just say, in the uprising who collected weapons and provided rebels with money, which is very interesting. Now, Jews from modern-day North Macedonia got their citizen rights after the region became a kingdom of Serbia. Very, very interesting. So let's speak a bit more about the previous period. Now, there's an excellent article out there, I think, on the monastir.org.il website that actually chronicles who were some of the rabbis at that point in time. So we're talking back in the early 1500s. We mentioned about Rabbi Yosef David Ben Lev. He was actually born in Monastir in the year 1502, actually became rabbi in Thessaloniki. He was the head of the court over there and was known, let's just say, as a person who, let's say, really, really defended the poor people inside the city at that point in time. And that's what we have to point out. He was a famous person, let's just say. He was born in the year 1502. There was actually other rabbis over there. I think notable people in the 1500s include Baruch Cohen from Ragoza, if I'm not mistaken. There was other famous people. And Rabbi Ben Aram HaKohen, in the middle of the 16th century, would serve as rabbi of Monastir, and he would move eventually to Thessaloniki and would also, let's say, make various different religious decisions that were connected to the Jews of Monastir at one stage in time. So he was another famous rabbi. It's very interesting. There was a traveler named Lorenzo Bernardo who visited Monastir in the year 1591, and I think he was close, or he spoke to Rabbi Shmuel Nachmias. Yeah. So who would actually know all the ins and outs of the Jewish community in the Monastir at that stage in time. Very, very interesting. I think they had, it's actually interesting. We mentioned about the famous Rabbi Yaakov Israel, who we're going to speak about in due course. He was a famous Macedonian rabbi. And that was, let's just say, at that specific era in time. We'll speak about more also about the Alliance school system as this class will go on. Because, friends, everyone, we are exploring the history of Macedonian Jewry. Now, prior to World War II, the Jewish community of Vardar, Macedonia, the area roughly corresponding to the borders of the present-day republic, was in Bitola. It was approximately 8,000 Jews. Skopje was approximately 3,000 Jews, and Stip approximately 500 Jews. The Jewish communities, let's say, during World War I, in small areas like Dodran, Strumica, that were close to the front line, were significantly affected, let's say, by fighting and fled the area. The partition of the region also adversely impacted the Jews in smaller centers, since it obviously deprived them of free flow for most of the merchant activities, the largest Jewish trading center in the Balkans. Now let's talk a bit about the Second World War at that stage in time, but very, very interesting. So we're going in the 1940th century. We'll just explore a few more of the rabbis. We're going to speak about Rabbi Yaakov Israel in due course. He was key rabbi, chief rabbi in Macedonia, rabbi we've spoken about here on various occasions before. It's actually interesting. In the year 1888, another famous rabbi, Rabbi Raphael Abraham Eshkalio, would publish a book of ethics called Years of Life in Monastir. So very, very interesting. So he was, and it's interesting, I think 186 Jewish people in the city will contribute to the publication of this book, which is very, very interesting. And he was another key figure, let's just say, in Monastir. without a doubt, also over there. So he would do that, and it's. I think there was actually a yeshiva at that point in time inside the city, and many Jews would move, I think especially late 1880s, to Skopje respectively. So that will be another center place, let's just say, at that stage in time. Yeah, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, the chief rabbi of monastery would become Rabbi Tzadok Cohen, I think, at a later stage. This would help with the Alliance in Paris, if I'm not mistaken, bringing this. And there was a man of the name Joseph Matalon, who was a principal of the Alliance School at Saloniki, that would actually visit the city. Remember, the Alliance school system will have a huge impact in Macedonia at that turn of the stage in the end of the 1800s, respectively. And that's something we will try and speak about more as this class progresses over here, as time comes on. But so it's very, very interesting that we're exploring the history, friends, anyone that's tuning in, of the Macedonian Jewish community. Now, the beginning of the 20th century would see changes to the rabbinate. I think there weren't many, it was less rabbis and spiritual leaders in the community, and that would cause problems, I think, at that point in time, like maybe other parts of the world, respectively. And education, they tried to improve the conditions, I think, in religious schools, especially in the early 1900s or late 1800s. They had that plan at that stage in time, and I think there was even a newspaper article come up May 15th, 1908, reported that for 10 to 12 years the community had no chief rabbi, which would obviously have a detrimental effect on the religious structure and the fabric of the community in of itself. And it's actually interesting. It will be Rabbi Yaakov Meir who would, I think, look to find a rabbi suitable for the community. Remember, Rabbi Yaakov Meir, I think, was chief rabbi of the Ottoman Palestine in the I don't know if it was Ottoman Palestine. It was in the year 1906. He was elected, and later on he'll become, for much longer point in time, in 1920. So it's very interesting. There's a lot of reporting in newspapers. I think there was a key newspaper at that stage in time called La Epoca, if I'm not mistaken, that would chronicle much of this. And very, very interesting. And there was other key figures at that point in time, especially in the education community, were people like Mr. Abraham Capuano. Very, very interesting enough. So he was, and other people also. So it's, I think in 1909, there was various different letters about leaders of the monastery community. I think people like Yechiel Kamchi, who we mentioned about, I think, just before. And the chief rabbi of Istanbul was someone named Rabbi Chaim Nachum. I think it was, to be precise, Rabbi Chaim Nachum Effendi. So they would, let's say, discuss within regards to the chief rabbinate at that stages of time. So there were many key figures at that stage. And there was a lot of Zionistic activity taking place, especially in the early 1900s. I think someone named Yosef Uziel from Saloniki would come to a monastery to promote Zionistic activity and would rouse interest among young people within regards to Zionism and movement to Eretz Yisrael. And just like in many other places also. So Rabbi Chaim Nachum would become a key figure over here with all the correspondence he was doing. And that was, we actually recorded a video, if I'm not mistaken, of Rabbi Chaim Nachum Effendi, if I'm not mistaken. Now, another key rabbi was someone named Rabbi Shabtai Dijayan. I think he would become the community's rabbi, if I'm not mistaken. And we're going to speak about him also in due course, because there was, remember, a lot of change going on at that stage in time. But let's speak a bit more about World War II and the Holocaust before we go back to some of the key rabbis at that point in time. Obviously, March 1941, Bulgaria became an ally of the Axis powers. Come on, 1941, the Bulgarian army would enter Vardar, Macedonia at that stage in time in an effort to recover, let's just say, the region, which it saw as a natural part of its own ancient homeland at that stage in time. So that's, I think Bulgarian authorities had already adopted an anti-Semitic law called the Law for Protection of the Nation. Now, I think in January 1941, according to US Holocaust Museum, using Wikipedia as a note, I think it was October the 4th, 1941, the Bulgarians would enforce extraordinary measures that prohibited the Jews of Macedonia from engaging in any type of industry or commerce. This was what was actually reported over, just using the notes over here. And over the course of 1942, there was harsh measures that were put against the Jewish people under their control in Varda, Macedonia, as well as in occupied northern Greece. That's another thing we have to point out. Some of the harsh demands by the Bulgarian government were that all Jewish households hand over 20% of the value of the assets. You can see the anti-Semitism there was at that point in time. The harsh measures culminated in 1943 with deportation upon orders from Germany of Macedonian Jews and Greek Jewry to the Bulgarian border on the river of Danube. From there was transported, unfortunately, through German boats and trains to German death camp in Treblinka. You always shed a tear when you hear these the atrocities that took place. Jews from Skopje, Stip, and Bitola, approximately 7,215, were kept in crowded, terrible, filthy conditions in 4 warehouses at Monopole for 11 days before being put on trains in Treblinka. And Nazi Germany, I think, even requested that Bulgarian finance the deportations. And just see the terrible things that actually took place. And there was it just always brings a tear to people when you actually read about it. Many Jews joined the partisans fighting the Nazis in Yugoslavia. In Varda, Macedonia, there was someone named Estria Chaim Ovadia. It was a woman, was a Jewish partisan from Bitola, who joined the Yugoslav partisans after the German invasion of Yugoslavia in 1941 during the Second World War. She was posthumously proclaimed People's Hero of Yugoslavia, a Jewish woman. She was from Bitola. She was the first woman to join, I believe, the partisan movement in 1941. That's what's reported over. I think much more can be said. Further, Jews were transported to the Bulgarian border with Romania on the river Danube, surrendering them to the Nazi German authorities at that point in time. There was harsh treatment before the Jews. They were transported in German cattle cars in Treblinka. A few dozen, Bitola Jews managed to avoid deportation and fought escape from the transit camp. None of the 3,276 Jews of Bitola deported to Treblinka survived, unfortunately. In 2003, one Jewish person remained in the city that had become, home to the Sephardic Jewish community for more than 400 years. Stip's ancient Jewish community was also completely destroyed. Now, after World War II in Yugoslav Macedonia, the total number of surviving Jews, according to the Society of Jewish Communities in Yugoslavia, was 419. Some sources state that the remnants of the Jewish community regathered in Belgrade in Serbia, and only 140 would survive. Most had survived by going into hiding or fighting with the Yugoslav Jewish partisans. Of those transported to death camps, nobody, unfortunately, survived. Very, very sad. Most survivors chose to emigrate to Israel, with some returning to North Macedonia, others remaining in Serbia, and other statistics. So I'm just going to take a short 1-minute break, and we're going to speak about the research and awareness of the Holocaust. So please, in the meantime, if you're not subscribed yet, please subscribe to the channel now. I'm just taking a very short break. I'll be back in 1 minute. Okay, friends? Hi, shalom everyone. Thanks for having the patience to wait. We're doing a special edition over here, exploring the history of Macedonian Jewry over here on this special edition over here. So thanks everyone for watching over here. Now we're going to talk about research and awareness of the Holocaust at that point in time. Very, very important topic. And yeah, we're speaking about it and just the horrors of what actually took place during the late 1930s, 1940s was absolutely horrific. So there was a lot of research and the combination of circumstances, let's say, determined little awareness in the decades after the war about the fate of Macedonian Jews, unfortunately, that were murdered in the Holocaust. Its impact also annihilated the Macedonian Jews communities. And only 12 of those sent to Treblinka are known to have survived to tell the story. After the defeat of the Axis, Varda Macedonia became again part of Yugoslavia. Its iteration as the communist Yugoslavia, the official line was avoiding delving into the crimes of World War II, as they were considered to be capable of potentially destabilizing the internal inter-ethnic Yugoslav relations. This was to some extent relaxed in the Macedonian case, let's just say, as the perpetrators were German and Bulgarian occupiers. Nevertheless, the mentioning of the fate of Macedonian Jews was minimal. Only in 1958, the historian Alexander Matkovsky published a tragedy of the Jews from Macedonia, and in 1959 translated the English under the title The Destruction of Macedonian Jewry in 1943, I think in the yearbook of Yad Vashem, and enlarged in a brochure in 1962. Now, anyone that's tuned in now, please subscribe to the channel now. We're exploring the history of Macedonian Jewry over here on this special edition. So please subscribe now to the channel, and so much great content. Now, in 1967, Yugoslavia cut diplomatic ties with Israel as it sided with Arabs in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. This appears to have added another layer to the avoidance of researching the Holocaust. In the 1970s, the Yugoslavian authorities ordered the Macedonian historians to counter the increasing Bulgarian claims about the non-existence of Macedonian identity. The Institute of National History published several detailed studies on various aspects of the Bulgarian occupation of Varda Macedonia in World War II, but the Holocaust and Bulgarian anti-Jewish measures were generally not covered. In Bulgaria, the post-war communist government increasingly focused the narrative on the issue of Bulgarian Jews. Let's just say at that stage in time. I think in 1983, Matkovsky broke the silence by publishing the first Macedonian language, A History of the Jews of Macedonia. Now, yes, that's interesting. The chapter, The Deportation and Liquidation of the Jews of Macedonia, updates, let's say, his previous book in 1962, describing what actually took place at that point in time. I think in 2010 to 2011, the Jews from Macedonia and the Holocaust sought to expand the scope of research and the spectrum of interdisciplinary angles, let's say, around this topic, and it materialized in a chrestomathy of 14 original works and archival documents, and also into an exhibition. Very, very interesting enough. So we're going to speak more about the modern era of 2000. Let's speak a bit more about the 1900s in of itself. There was it was a time period also, I think, just going back to the early 1900s, where there was trying to be more secular, let's say, education that was bringing about, especially with the Alliance School. That was when I think Rabbi Dejan would actually head at that point in time. So he was in correspondence with people from that point in time. There was Zionistic youth clubs, especially in the early 1900s. There was plays, I think, at that point in time. There was association members, let's just say. There was various different clubs. There was actually, interesting enough, a Torah study club founded by a scholar named Rabbi Yitzchak Elisafan. I think he was a teacher, Chazan, he was an actor. I'm not sure if he had smicha or not. I think it was from Saloniki, and he passed away in Haifa in the year 1940, where Hebrew songs, plays connected to Zionism was really, let's say, just increasing at that stage in time. So remember, Rabbi Yaakov Meir would have a pivotal role in correspondence with many of the rabbis and leaders of the various different communities at that point in time. I think there was another famous rabbi in Bitola, someone named Rabbi Avram Romano, who would publicize a report describing, let's say, the situation of Jews in Bitola, and just talking about, from a financial point of view, and just entire structure within regards to the community in and of itself. I think we're going to speak a bit about Rabbi Avram Romano, because he was a It was also a famous rabbi who we've, I think, spoken about on various occasions. We actually recorded a video, I think, on Rabbi Avram Romano. If I recollect, I think it was, to be precise, this video was, I think there was also Rabbi Menachem Avram Romano. So there were two key people, let's just say, at that stage in time. Rabbi Avram, so we'll speak about Rabbi Avram first, because he also become a famous Macedonian rabbi, a famous rabbi we've spoken about on various occasions before over here. So he, I think, lived between 1853 to 1937. He did, the famous rabbi did. He was, I think he was actually born in Sarajevo and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and he would learn under the great rabbis of Sarajevo also, respectively. He would, what's interesting, I think he was close to other rabbis. I think the chief rabbi who was before him was Rabbi Avram Avinon, if I'm not mistaken. I think he was the chief rabbi of Serbia at that point in time. Remember, they had close ties, I think, with those rabbis. It's actually interesting. The famous historian Moshe David Gaon would actually chronicle a lot of these things in his excellent books, his excellent encyclopedic works in of itself. So I think it's actually interesting. He would, if I'm not mistaken, he would learn in the famous rabbinic ceremony in Vienna, if I'm not mistaken. He was close to another rabbi, who was chief rabbi at the time of Croatia, if I'm not mistaken, Rabbi Moshe Moritz Levi, who was a famous sofer and a historian who we'll speak about various occasions for. Rabbi Avram Romano will eventually, I think, learn in the famous Yeshivat Bet El. He would teach that, and it was also part of Yeshivat Porat Yosef at that stage in time, and was very, very famous, let's just say. So he had the son of the name Rabbi Menachem Romano over here, who would also have a key role. He lived between 1882 to 1968, and he was a rabbi in various places also. I think in Sarajevo, he was part of the Austrian Hungarian area at that stage in time. So he was also a key rabbi over there. And it's actually interesting. So Rabbi Moritz, now we're going to speak now about another Rabbi Avram Romano over here in a minute, and who was actually the chief rabbi of Bitola. But Rabbi Menachem Romano was the son of this great rabbi, Rabbi Avram Romano. Now there's another Rabbi Avram Romano, someone of the full title, Rabbi Avram or Moritz Romano. So who was he? He, I believe, lived between the years 1894 to 1943. So he was also a famous, a very, very key rabbi, let's just say. He was, I think he was born in Biblina, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I think his brother was someone named Solomon, and he would have various sisters also, and he was learning in the yeshiva in Sarajevo, if I'm not mistaken. He actually get ordained in the rabbinate over there, and obviously he was close to Rabbi Avram Romano. I think that was his uncle, if I'm not mistaken, but so that's very, very interesting. He was the nephew, I believe, of Rabbi Avram Romano. So I think between 1919 to 1923, he was the chief rabbi of Bajna. This was a famous place in itself, I think, based in Bosnia. And then he'll become, I believe, the rabbi of the Kahila of Dubrovnik, if I'm not mistaken. This was another part, I think, in around the Balkans area also, respectively. And then I think in 1931, he will become the chief rabbi of Bitilo. This is obviously in Macedonia, so he will make his mark over there. Rabbi Moritz Romano with Avram Moritz Romano, to give his full title, where a lot of activities was going on, and he actually saw this difficult economic and social situation in Macedonia. Obviously, I think before him there wasn't necessarily a chief rabbi before we talked about there, and he worked in internal migration for the community in of itself. He was, I think, connected with various different newspapers, and he would encourage the community's youth to actually move to Palestine at that point in time, bring people from Bitola, from Macedonia, and very much come to those parts in of itself. And much can be mentioned about him, but I believe he was chief rabbi of his time, which is very interesting. Rabbi Avram Moritz Romano. So that's another key rabbi in the history of the Macedonian Jewry over there. So he would really he would also publish comprehensive studies of the Jews of Bitola, if I'm not mistaken. Various surveys he will actually take about and publicize reports describing obviously this tough situation there was in the places, the image of the Jews of Bitola within regards to how they actually were at that stage in time, And I think Tzvi Rothmiller would actually respond to some of his findings, Rabbi Romano's writings also, within regards to maybe debating maybe some of the publications and the studies in of itself. But he would publish a very, very comprehensive, let's say, study within regards to all the different the structures and science within regards to Macedonian Jewry at that stage in time is something that we've got to point out. So so he was in correspondence, and that was a big time period, let's just say, at that stage in time. I think the chief rabbi of Yugoslavia was Rabbi Yitzhak Alkalai, especially in the mid-1930s, and there was a lot of Zionistic activity, as we said before, that was going on. So there's a lot of correspondence between that. We're going to speak about Rabbi Shabtai Dijian also in the next coming minutes, who was also chief rabbi just before, I think, Rabbi Romano was. There was other rabbis, as mentioned before. Rabbi Yitzhak Al-Safon, who mentioned before, would actually do various different plays and so on and so forth. And there was a little community life was strong. I don't know how strong the Torah life was in of itself. There was also another, Rabbi Leon Kamchi, who was working very much in Zionistic activities, who we just mentioned about just before also. So that's it's actually interesting. Just going back to Rabbi Dijian, he would write, I think, for the World Sephardi Federation in Jerusalem, and I think they were in connection with the Keren HaYesod and other, within regards to Jewish national funds and so on and so forth, various different Zionistic organizations all over the world. So that's something that we've got to point out about these rabbis that were very well connected. There was Hebrew education, especially at the start of the 1920s, that would come about at that stage in time. Many of the schools, obviously, complementing Zionism in of itself, and they would bring about an entire structure. But the one thing they did advocate was aliyah to the land of Israel, to moving to Eretz Israel in of itself at that point in time. So that's very interesting. So there's actually an excellent article out there in the monastery.org.il website, which I recommend everyone to actually look into, because they actually give I think, a 329-page, let's say, publication within regards to all the famous rabbis, the famous school structures, and famous family histories of the, let's just say, the various different famous families that were from Macedonia. But that's definitely, I recommend everyone to read this article. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about the modern period of Macedonia as a whole. I think presently the Jewish community itself is about 200 people. Almost everyone's living in the area of Skopje, respectively. In Stip, there's a few people, and in Bitola, there's pretty much, and I don't think many people. I think the community opened in 2000 at the Bet Yaakov synagogue and a community centre in Skopje. The community maintains ties with Jewish communities in Belgrade, Saloniki. A rabbi, I think, travelled to Skopje from Belgrade to aid conducting of services. And very interesting. I think January 2020 saw the government of North Macedonia appoint its first Jewish government cabinet minister, Labour and social policy minister, someone named Rosella Mizrahi. Very interesting enough. So this is something else we've got to point about. Okay, now religious revival. The first Balkan Rabbinical Conference was also held, I think, over there, organised by Jewish community in North Macedonia, the Yeshiva Beit Midrash Sephardi, Rabbi Shlomo Kassin, famous rabbi, and the World Zionist Organization, Department for Religious Affairs in Diaspora in Jerusalem. It was led by Rabbi Yechiel Wasserman and the government of North Macedonia. I think 25 rabbis from all over the world would participate, including chief rabbis from Moscow, Croatia, Serbia, Romania, Strasbourg, Lyon, also the Yeshiva Beit Midrash Sephardi, Rabbi Ezra Kassin, a rabbi we've recorded with on this channel, and other rabbis from the Yeshivot who were also serving around that point in time. I think people, even the European Jewish Congress president would actually turn up there. Someone named Mr. Moshe Kantor would participate. Now, there's a Holocaust museum in Skopje, respectively, in memory of the North Macedonian Jews who perished in the Holocaust. And the modern building, I think, is located on the heart of what was once the city's Jewish quarter, respectively. It was the Macedonian President George Ivanov who recalled the long history of cohabitation with Jewish people and Macedonians, and said that with the loss of the Jews, a part of the Republic of Macedonia had been torn out, and that on the Jewish streets of Skopje, Bitola and Stip, after the war, there was silence over there. So that's very interesting. So, much is actually chronicled within regards to Macedonia Jewish history, especially in recent times. Now, Monastir is a main place, let's just say, of Macedonia. So let's concentrate speaking on Monastir now for a few moments over here. Yeah, so very interesting. I think the Monastir province was an Ottoman vilayet. It was created, I think, in the year 1864, encompassing territories in present-day Albania, North Macedonia, let's say one of the successor states of the former Yugoslavia, which declared independence in 1991, and Greece. Okay, now, as I said before, the Sephardic Jewish community of Monastir, I think it was on March 11th, 1943, historically largest Jewish community in Macedonia, was deported. The Jews who trace their ancestry to Macedonia city, known since 1913 as Bitola, continue to call the city by the name it bore during the centuries of Ottoman rule. Obviously, we spoke about what happened between 1941 to 1944. Bulgarian alliance with Nazi Germany occupied the Yugoslav province of Macedonia, and the Germans deported, as we said before, the Jewish population of Monastir and environs to their deaths, I think, unfortunately, in Treblinka, as part of their plan to wipe out European Jews. Now, Monastir Jewish people before the Second World War. Although the Jews had lived, obviously, in Monastir was talked about in Roman times over here, the Sephardic Jews who originally migrated from Iberian Peninsula in the 15th century became the predominant group in the town by the 16th century. They maintained a high traditional and distinctive lifestyle characterized by residence in a Jewish quarter attached to the Judeo-Spanish Ladino language and Sephardic folklore. There was commitment at that point in time to religious Jewish life, observance, allegiance, let's just say Jewish communal institutions, synagogues, religious schools, religious courts, and mutual aid societies. We mentioned before, now we're mentioning, actually we didn't mention this before, in 1863, unfortunately there was a fire that would destroy much of the Jewish quarter in Macedonia, I think Monastir, and the community would turn to the world's leading philanthropist, England's Sir Moses Montefiore, a famous man we've spoken about here on the series, born from an Italian Sephardic Jewish family, for assistance in reconstruction. This appeal to the West marked the beginning of the Sephardic community's reorientation towards European culture, let's just say, and gradual introduction of secular education and values, let's say, into population that will obviously have a knock-on effect, unfortunately, religiously, I would also assume. These changes took place at the same time new transportation links would actually come back with Salonika trade and brought economic prosperity to the Monastir Jewish community. There was obviously, we talked about cultural and economic development was cut short by political upheavals, I think especially from 1903. There was a Macedonian rebellion against the Turkish rulers of Ottoman Empire, ethnic violence, unfortunately, among Greeks, Bulgarians, and this would result of thousands of Jewish monastrilis as emigrating to North and South America, Jerusalem, and Salonika, respectively, also over there. So we talked about it. I think at the turn of the 20th century, Monastir's Jewish population reached nearly 11,000, but by 1914, years of emigration had reduced the community to just over 6,000 over there. And obviously, we talked about how Zionism would emerge, especially in the 1930s. And we spoke about what happened during the Holocaust already just a few minutes ago also, and would all the horrors that would actually occur at that stage in time. So, yeah, it's actually interesting. They say that there's a Monastir photographic collection. I think photographs of nearly every Jewish adult in Monastir, more than half the community, were collected by the Bulgarian authorities, apparently, in the first half of 1942. That many of the Jewish inhabitants of Eastern Europe were required to submit photographs for purposes of police registration, work permits, ration cards, both inside and outside the ghettos established by Germany or its Axis allies. Few of these photograph collections survived the war intact, and the Monastir registration photographs constitute one of the rare collections. Now, the origins of the Monastir photographic collection lay in directive given by the Bulgarian occupation authorities of early 1942 to the Jews of Monastir over there. So that's something we've spoken about before. I think, if I'm not mistaken, police registers would later on be donated to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, but not before a large percentage of the photos were removed by survivors, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Photographs are currently available in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So let's explore some of the famous people, I think, of Macedonia. Raphael Moshe Kamki, who we mentioned about before, he lived between the years 1870 to 1970, so about 100 years. He was a Sephardic Jew from Monastir in Ottoman Macedonia. He had strong attachment to religion in Macedonia, and he looked at Macedonia as his native homeland, let's just say, in itself. He was elected liaison officer of the internal Macedonian Revolutionary organization. He was very well connected. He would actually pass away in Tel Aviv in the year 1970, but he was very, very well connected. We talked about the uprising also, where he was actively part of it, respectively. And let's just say he would move to Sofia. I think he would be there till 1949, eventually moving to Israel, if I'm not mistaken. And at the request of the Macedonian Scientific Institute and the Jewish Institute in Sofia, he would work on memoirs in Bulgaria. And then in Tel Aviv, he would have correspondence with various institutions in Sofia. And he passed away, I think he was 100 years of age in Tel Aviv, respectively. A lot was put in his memory. I think would write various different articles on him. Various historiographers, respectively, would also do memoirs. I think in the Bulgarian State Archive of the Jewish collection of books and documents will archive Bulgarian and Ladino, let's just say, collection of memoirs of Raphael Kampi were published under the Voivoda Skender Bey, I think in 2000. In March 2011, the President of Macedonia, I believe, addressed participants of the central commemorative gathering in remembrance of the Holocaust of Macedonian Jews and emphasized that Kampi was one of the promoters of the idea of a free and independent Macedonia. That's something that we have to point out also, so that's very, very interesting. But we're speaking here about Monastir now, just a famous community in of itself. There's a lot of famous, rich culture, especially from this specific area in of itself, respectively. So we could say more within regards to Monastir in of itself, especially 17th, 18th, 19th century, 20th century, respectively, that actually took place. There was religious life over there, as we mentioned before, all throughout that point in time. So let's talk a bit about maybe the education side of things that we mentioned about before. There was, especially in Ottoman community, Ottoman time periods, there were Torah being taught in various levels. Now, Rabbi Yosef Raphael Yisrael would found the Kilat Yaakov, I believe, at one point in time. I think the yeshiva, which he found, would eventually get destroyed in this fire, which we spoke about before, which during that point in time. I think that during the Ottoman period, the authorities of Shu recognized a chief rabbi over there. So many people that would have the chief rabbi role, especially Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael, who we can speak about in a minute, would have official titles, especially in, let's just say, in Macedonia in of itself. I think there were school systems over there, especially Alliance schools. I think there was Mikveh Yisrael schools also, which was also connected. I think it was more of an agricultural school. Remember, these schools were more on the secular side, let's just say, in especially in many of the Sephardic countries, they would actually come about at that stage in time. So very, very interesting. So I would like to speak in a couple of minutes' time with regards to Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael, who was a famous rabbi over there in Macedonia, now the chief rabbi of his time. Now, friends, anyone that's just tuned in here to this live video over here, please subscribe to the channel. We're nearing 7,500 subscribers over here. Today, we happen to be speaking about Macedonian Jewish history over here, the Jewish community history, which is very, very much a special edition and very important that we are exploring the history of it. So Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael, who was he? He lived between 1819 to 1889. He was, I think, born actually in Monastir in Macedonia, and he passed away with 70 years of age. His Hilula actually was on the 7th of Tishrei. He would be the chief rabbi of Macedonia, Monastir, from 1854 till 1889, I think, if I'm not mistaken. He was close to Moses Montefiore, as mentioned before, especially at the time period when the fire broke out. He was it's actually interesting. His father was another famous rabbi, Rabbi Yosef Yaakov Yisrael. I think he lived between 1775 to 1846, who was a rabbi and Moret Tzedek of the Jewish congregation, I think, between 1810 to 1846. His grandfather was a rabbi named Rabbi Yaakov Raphael Yisrael, who lived between 1745 to 1820, who would establish the Yeshivat Kehilat Yaakov, if I'm not mistaken. Now, Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael would learn in Jerusalem and receive rabbinic ordination, I think, from famous Rabbi Nissim Shmuel Yehuda Orovitz, who was the author of the Darkei Ish, respectively, and I think various other rabbis he was close to, including Rabbi Avram Ashkenazi, who lived between 1811 to 1880, if I'm not mistaken. He was a Rishon LeZion, a chief rabbi. Rabbi Rachmim Shaltiel Yaakov Nino, who was, I think, related to Rabbi Yaakov Shaltiel Nino, if I'm not mistaken, who was a famous Kabbalist, I think, of Tzfat. He was a chavruta with another... I think maybe he was a chavruta of Rabbi Yisrael, if I'm not mistaken. He would... I think come to Monastir, work as a dayan there. He would work in the Jewish court of Rabbonim inside the city, and his name became very famous, especially in the year 1849. And it was eventually in 1854 he was appointed the chief rabbi of Macedonia, the Jewish community of Monastir, respectively. And he was known as a famous posek over there, a rabbi that will render different Jewish laws. We talked about in the year 1860, הגיע למונסטיר המיסיונו אפרים אפשטיין והחל לפעול בקרב הקהילה להמרת דתם של מי מבינה. הרב יעקב ישראל נפגש עם אפשטיין וניהל עמו ויכוח תיאולוגי על צמיחתו של התלמוד, הפילוסופיה של הרמב"ם וחוזקה של המסורת. אפשטיין מצאה את ביקורו אצל הרב ואת ביקור הגמל בביתו של הקונסול האנגלי כנעים ומנומוס. הוא מציין כי היחס עליה היה ידידותי, אף על פי שמטרת הגתה הייתה ברורה. ניכר שהרב היה בעל ביטחון עצמי ולא חשש מפועלו, שכן שליחותו של אפשטיין לא הצליחה והוא עזב את העיר. Okay, so just speaking about that, sorry about the Hebrew over there. I think in 1863 that was the time period when the fire broke out in Monastir that led to devastation, and at that stage in time Moses Montefiore will really help re-establish, let's just say, it's at that point in time Macedonia. There was a lot reported even in the Jewish Chronicle with regards to him. I think maybe some form of appeal at that point in time. I think in London, the congregation in London will actually help out to some specific degree also within regards to it. Now, Rabbi Yisrael, I believe, passed away in 1889, and he was buried, I think, in the Jewish cemetery of that specific city in itself, respectively. And I think various memorials, especially in the year 2015, was actually put in his memory. He was the author of the Yismach Yisrael, which printed in Belgrade in 1896, and the Yigal Yaakov, which printed in 1900. And I think there's commemorations, I think, in the Monastir. I think there's a road named after him in the old city of Be'er HaItzka Yerushalayim, near the Beit Knesset of Churva. The Beit Knesset Yigal Yaakov. Now, it's interesting, a synagogue would be named after him in Jerusalem. Now, I think we mentioned this at the time period when we recorded the video on Rav Yisrael, respectively. And I think it's a Macedonian synagogue in Jerusalem, respectively, somewhere we actually walked past, and I think we visited on this channel, if I'm not mistaken, already over here. So he was another famous rabbi in Macedonia, who obviously we must speak about over here, friends. Okay, so let's continue over here. So we've spoken about, friends, anyone tuning in, we're exploring the history of famous rabbis of Macedonia at the moment. We're exploring the history of Macedonian Jewry at the moment, the Jewish community in Macedonia, and of Monastir also, respectively. So if anyone is tuning in at the moment, please subscribe to the channel now, and a lot of benefits to subscribing, a lot of excellent content we are trying to bring about, and important, very, very much important content in of itself. So we're talking about the different years, especially after post-war Holocaust, before the Holocaust what actually took place. At that point in time, we're just speaking about Rabbi Yisrael, who was a rabbi in the Kehillah. Let's speak a bit more about the famous rabbis of the community in of itself, because I think this is obviously, because we're a channel that's exploring the history of rabbis, it's important that we are now speaking about the rabbinic structure in Monastir. Now we've spoken about the chinuch a little bit, so and then we're going to speak about the Beit Knesset, the various different synagogues that there was in a Monastir also. So so very, very interesting. So among the rabbis, rabbinic history over here, we'll just mention a few. So we know there were outstanding leaders in a Monastir all throughout. So, so I think during the Ottoman period, there was someone named Rabbi David Ben Lev, who we mentioned about before, who would settle the monastery. And he was a famous rabbi, I think, very well known in the 16th century. He was connected very much to Saloniki, also the Beit Midrash over there, so which we've spoken about on various occasions before here inside this series. So he was a famous rabbi, which we have to point out. Then I think, especially in the 16th century, there was a rabbi named Rabbi Shlomo HaKohen, who was nicknamed, I've said before, Hamar HaShach, respectively. He was a famous posek. He was one of the great rabbis, also in Greece. He was an author of a Shut Shelot Shuvot question and answers book. He would be a rabbi, I think, in a monastery also. He was one of the great Sephardi poskim of his time, respectively. There was Yosef Al-Ro'iti, David Loka, Shmuel Nachmias, Benjamin Jaskan. I think, very interesting enough, they were, I think, more rabbis over there at that stage in time. I think in the 17th century, there was Rabbi Benjamin Medina. He was Talmidosh Rabbi Mordechai Kali. Very interesting. Rabbi Mordechai Kali was a Rosh Yeshiva in Saloniki, so he would take a premiership role. I think after 1643, they would appoint Rabbi Avram Falcon, one of the great rabbis of Saloniki, to become the chief rabbi of Monastir. Another rabbi, I think we mentioned about him on various occasions before. 16th, 17th century, to the At-Tisisat Mitzchat Ve'ir. I think very interesting. Bishnot Esrim Shel Shesahit Shebe'ir Onesh Shlomo Molcho. I think he would actually be part of the city. He was way earlier, in the year 1500 to 1532, the author of the Sefer HaMefu'ar and Cheshivet Ketz, respectively, over there. And we talked about Nathan of Gaza was connected very much to the Sabbatinian movement over there. So that we did mention about way earlier on in this video, respectively. 18th century, Rabbi Benjamin Medina will be the rabbi there. Rabbi Avram Ben Yehuda di Boton, who was the author of the Machazeh Avram. And David di Boton, I think, was one of the rabbis of the congregation. 19th century, we see Rabbi Avram Ben Benavisti, I think, Gadin Baal Tzel HaKesef. And I think he would actually come from Saloniki also, respectively. I'm not sure if he was in another one. There was another rabbi of the congregation of there, Rabbi Avram Ger Tzedek, who was born, I think, in Monastir in the year 1800, passed away in Saloniki in 1875. So much has been said within regards to that, respectively, over here. We talked about the various Zionistic activities that actually took place, all those points of time. We spoke about Rabbi Yaakov ben Yosef Yisrael, who was a chief rabbi and the author of Yigal Yaakov, who was more Tzedek. And I think 1888 he would, bring about many importances, let's just say, in itself. Now, the Beit Knesset, we're going to speak about the Beit Knesset Yigal Yaakov now, just for a minute, because that's a synagogue named after Rabbi Yisrael. I think it's actually for the Macedonian community in Jerusalem. It was founded, I think, around 1930, 1932. It has 2 floors and a splendid synagogue. I think originally it was in the Makor Baruch neighborhood, if I'm not mistaken. And it would, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it would move on later on. But I have to double check on that, respectively, over there. So I think it's actually based in, it's got 2 floors itself. It's in the Alfandari Street, I think, in Makor Baruch in Jerusalem, respectively. So that's very interesting. That's Yigal Yaakov synagogue, obviously named after Rabbi Yisrael over there. So, I think in 1902, there was a rabbi named Rabbi David Papo, who would become the chief rabbi, if I'm not mistaken, of Monastir in Macedonia. Let's speak a bit about him also. He was also a chief rabbi in Turkey, in Tripoli, in Libya, respectively, in Baghdad, in Iraq, and he was one of the managers of the famous hospital Miskav Ledach in Jerusalem. He was head of Jewish court. I was part of the Sephardic Community Committee, I believe, in Jerusalem. He was born in the year 1848 and passed away in 1927. On the 22nd of Nisan is Rabbi David Paposki Lula. So he was a chief rabbi in Macedonia in his time. Rabbi we've spoken about here on various occasions before. We did record a video with him at that point in time. Let's say a bit more about Rabbi David Papo. I think in Macedonia he will take on a lot of very importances in of itself. He was close to Rabbi Yaakov Meir, if I'm not mistaken. Also Rabbi Yitzchak Ashkenazi, if I'm not mistaken, who was a famous rabbi, also very much connected to the Miskav Ledach hospital, let's just say, in of itself. And he would be a chief rabbi in Tripoli, would move to Bursa. He was the head of Jewish courts in these places. Also in Macedonia, he would serve as a rabbi, I think, for a couple of years, if I'm not mistaken, and then would move eventually to Baghdad, respectively. So he was He actually worked in Sephardic Community Committee along with other famous rabbis, including Rabbi Yosef Shaul Elisha, Rabbi Raphael Shlomo Alaniada, Rabbi Hanania Gabriel, Rabbi Yosef Mordechai Halevi, and Rabbi Avram Bijato, if I'm not mistaken. Very, very interesting enough, and much has been said about him. He wrote a lot of books. Also, Rabbi David Papodete. He was also a chief rabbi, if I'm not mistaken, of Macedonia. So we spoke about Rabbi Chaim Nachum Effendi that before. That also had correspondence along with Rabbi Yaakov Meir with rabbis in Salonika, respectively. Now, another rabbi, I think after the Balkan Wars, if I'm not mistaken, another key figure would be Rabbi Ariel Ben Zion. Who is he? I don't know if we spoke about him yet, per se. He was born in the 1880, he passed away in 1932. He was a philosopher, historian, he was a poet. Also, he was one of the famous rabbis, Sephardi Zionistic rabbis in Jerusalem in his stage. And if I'm not mistaken, he would actually have a role also in Macedonia, if I'm not mistaken. So he was, I think he actually learned in yeshivot, such as Bet El, also in Chesed El, Tiferet Yerushalayim, and so on and so forth. But I think at one stage in time, if I'm not mistaken, he would become a rabbi in Bitola. He was, I think it was in the year 1913, he was appointed the rabbi in a monastery in Macedonia, respectively. And later on, he would become a rabbi, I think, also in Serbia, if I'm not mistaken. One thing he did was a lot of Zionistic activity all throughout his life. And I think he wrote books. I think he had two books, Asar Shalom Sharabi, if I'm not mistaken, printed in 1930 in Jerusalem, and Hilula, if I'm not mistaken. Very, very interesting. So he's another key figure of that point in time that we have to actually point out. Okay, now, as we mentioned before, another chief rabbi, I think, that was appointed in the year 1924 of Macedonia was a rabbi of the name Rabbi Shabtai Gian, if I'm not mistaken. I think he actually learned, if I'm not mistaken, in the famous rabbinical seminary in Turkey, which we also recorded a video. Now, he was a Sephardic rabbi. He was actually brought up in Bulgaria, Rabbi Shabtai Jain. If I hope I pronounced the name correctly. He was working in Romania, also in Argentina, in Uruguay, in Chile. He obviously in Macedonia also. He was a playwrightist. He was a educator. He was a philosopher, if I'm not mistaken, and so on and so forth. He was a famous rabbi of his time. So he was, let's just speak about him. He was columnist both in Ladino and Serbian. He was one of the central figures of Sephardic Jewish diaspora between the two world wars. His family, I think, actually came from Jaen, if I'm not mistaken, and the Lusian, if I'm not mistaken, area. His family originated before the expulsion. He served as chief rabbi of Sephardic Jews in Argentina and Uruguay from 1929 to 1931, chief rabbi of Sephardic community in Bucharest between 1931 to 1944. He was obviously born in the Pleven in the Ottoman Empire in 1883. His father was Joseph de Gian, and his mother was Malka Bajorano. So I wonder if he was related or descended from Rabbi Chaim Bajorano. He was known for adventurous spirit, let's just say. He studied at the seminary of the Alliance Universal in Istanbul. That was the Istanbul Rabbinic Seminary. That was under Rabbi Abraham Dunon, who we mentioned about before. And he would study in the University of University of Belgrade, if I'm not mistaken. He passed away in 1947 in Argentina. Interesting enough. Okay, he was in Bosnia and in Serbia. And he reported to have accompanied the first Bosnian and Serbian immigrants to Ottoman Palestine. And he taught Hebrew later on. He would return. He found two youth organizations, I think in Belgrade, Gideon for high schoolers and Hataya for working youth. There was funding from the community. He would travel to Jerusalem to study Torah, it's reported over. He would serve as a shliach tzibur, a cantor, and as a rabbi. He lived in the Balkans, mainly in the Kingdom of Serbia and the Kingdom of Romania, as we spoke before. And he would live in Austrian Bosnia, in Sarajevo, and in Travnik, if I'm not mistaken, in this point in time. But now he was the chief rabbi of monastery. I think it was at the suggestion of the chief rabbi of Sephardic Jews in Yugoslavia, Rabbi Alkali. The Gian settled in monastery, Rabbi Dejan would, in Macedonia, and he would return to the Balkans. He served between the years 1925 to 1928 as a chief rabbi of the community. He would work tirelessly to create national consensus among Sephardi Jewry around the globe. He was one of the founders of the World Confederation of Sephardic Jews, established at the Vienna Conference in 1925. He had support with the government of Belgrade, also we had to point out. He toured across Sephardic communities in the Americas and raised money for children who were orphaned in the Balkan Wars, as well as renovation of the Jewish cemetery he would do. And it's reported over, if I'm not mistaken, from Kahal Aragon, I don't know if it's maybe a historian or not, he would remove the mechitza inside the synagogue, so maybe going much more liberal than the Orthodox way, let's just say, at that stage in time. And he would establish the first Jewish kindergarten, I think, over there. He would also work in South America, moved to Argentina, serving as chief Sephardic rabbi from 29 to 31. He would speak at the inauguration of the Great Synagogue in Corrientes, if I'm not mistaken, and promoted the study of Hebrew while he was in South America to a big level. He would do Talmud Torah classes over there at the stage in time. He would teach, and he would visit Spain famously in 1931, meeting with the Spanish Foreign Minister Algerardo Lero, if I'm not mistaken. And during his tenure, he would become the chief rabbi of Buenos Aires. And obviously, he was more on the modern approach within regards to religious authority itself, and that might have been an issue at that stage in time inside that specific area. I think between 1921 to 1930, Sephardic community in Romania didn't have its own rabbi. 1930 would see Rabbi Dejian elected as a Mare Rabbin, the grand rabbi over that with the communities, let's just say, in itself. And I think was celebrated by the Kahal Grande Synagogue, if I'm not mistaken, in Romania. This was in 1931, September 1931. He would, he would bring back Torah studies in the yeshiva hall of Kahal Grand. And I think one of the rabbis before him was someone named Rabbi Jacob Yitzchak Niempower, if I'm not mistaken, who was a definitely a Romanian, more modern rabbi, reported over. Now, I think he left Romania in the year 1944, Rabbi Dejian would visit British Palestine and returned 2 years later to Argentina, where they're working in Sephardic synagogues in Camajo Street and Shalom Synagogue on Oloroz Street. And he died in 1947. And very, very interesting. Now, I think his grandson, Ricardo Jayan, would eventually move to America and publicize his grandfather's writings. Rabbi Dejian would write, really was strong Ladino heritage he had. Throughout his life, he would write songs in his language, as well as 20 plays, it's reported over. In 1904, he presented some of his plays for the first time with his students at a Jewish school in Travnik in Bosnia. Different works were published, I think, in Argentina. I think Amo Ayala and Aldina Quante would, of the Free University of Berlin and Hebrew University of Jerusalem, would print things respectively. So he was a famous rabbi, let's just say, at his time, also in Macedonia. That's what we also have to point out. And we're going to speak about the synagogues now a little bit over here. In Macedonia, famous synagogues there were of that stage in time. Very interesting. I think after the arrival of Spanish exiles, 2 central synagogues were built inside the city. What were the names of these synagogues? The Kahal Aragon and the Kahal Portugal. Beit Knesset Kahal Portugal. Let's speak about that. It was, I think, in the Rachab Memadim V'Gvoa Yachasit Le'Mavanim Acherim, if I'm not mistaken, over there. So let's speak a bit about this synagogue. I think it was formed, if I'm not mistaken, not too sure, maybe between 1580 to 1590 it was built. It took about 10 years. And it was, let's say, more of the southern part of Macedonia, if I'm not mistaken, this was built in. And a famous synagogue, let's just say, for the community that were expelled from Portugal, especially over there. And I think the Sultan of, we'll call in Ottoman Turkish, I think the places there was communities, there was a community courtyard over there inside this committee where the synagogue was. I think the structure itself was very, very interesting. A little debate and speaking is within regards to that also. So it's much more can be said about that. So there's what other synagogues also, which we will bring up now, which I think is actually very, very important to bring up over here. So I think it talks about over here, just reading articles here from Wikipedia with regards to the history of the synagogue with architecture. It was let's just say at that stage in time the architect and what was going on. There was other synagogues also all over the places. So that was a famous synagogue. I think 1886 would see התגוררו בעיר 4,000 יהודים. תולדו בה 9 בית כנסת. There was 9 synagogues. בית כנסת קהל ארגען, קהל פורטוגל, בית כנסת של פורטוגלים, מורונוס. היו הגדולים המרכזיים שבניהם, עם גדולי אוכסלנית הקהילה. In 1907, הוקם בית כנסת עוזה דלים. So what was that over here? That was another key synagogue here in Macedonia. The עוזה דלים. I think in Bitola, I think respectively, that was, I think, not mistaken, in the year 1906 it was. So we're talking about 120 years ago, nearly. It was for the Portuguese exiles, if I'm not mistaken. And they would live inside the square over here, special square in the old city of the Turkish Ottoman areas in of itself. And yeah, that would be a key place, let's just say, in that stage in time. There was, we could actually speak more about the various synagogues, respectively, but we haven't got that much time. So that is something that we have to point out. So that was another synagogue over there. Over here. So we spoke about this one, and I think parts of the synagogue that would help the poor. There was a prayer hall inside there. There was seminaries that was operating all over the city, and there was community dignitaries over there that were very, very key people. That's what we have to point about. The Portugal synagogue and the Portuguese synagogue were completely destroyed, I think, during one of the world wars. I'm not too sure. Maybe it was even the first one, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, I think during the war, the synagogue of the Ozer Delim was unfortunately also desecrated to some degree, if I'm not mistaken. And many of the synagogues were completely destroyed during the war time period. So that's also an important thing to state out over here. So we spoke about the rabbis over here. We're speaking about the history of Macedonian Jewish. So anyone that's just turned up and switches on, please subscribe to the channel, friends, and join our community. So please smash the subscribe button. Now, the Beit HaKvarot of the Jewish community of Bitula, I think it was formed in the year 1497. The cemetery was in of itself, and there was obviously, unfortunately, some destruction of the community in the Holocaust. The cemetery was, I think, later abandoned. It's reported over. So obviously, anti-Semitism would actually take place, and some damage would be done by vandals afterwards. So that's something we have to point out. Now, especially, there was in the Jewish community of Monastir, there was various relief societies and charitable organizations all throughout. Chevra Kadisha societies, I think, and there was medical care that was provided to the members of association over there. There was membership fees, there was medication expenses, I think, were covered also, and so on and so forth. So various important things. Now, Bitola community itself is a place thriving in culture and folklore, let's just say, in of itself. So various different plays came about, especially in the 1900s, it became famous for, and various different community folklore, song, proverbs, and so on and so forth. There's there's another key figure over here we didn't mention yet, Rabbi Yaakov Avram Yonah, I believe his name. I'm not sure if he was a rabbi, I'm not 100% sure. He was actually born in Monastir. He's a Macedonian rabbi. He was a poet, he was a songwriter, and very, very famous in his time. Let's speak about Rabbi Yaakov Avram Yonah here for a minute over here in this special edition. He was born, I think, in 1863 in Monastir. He moved to Saloniki eventually, and he was involved in the spiritual and cultural life of the Jewish community in the city. There was a printing house, publishing house. I think Rabbi Yonah, I think he was a rabbi, I'm not 100% sure, began his career as a copyist in a political journal called a political journal over there. I think he was gifted with that kind of thing. He had a specific voice. He could be confident, I think, to read at Shliach Dibor. He would publish original poems accompanied by additional texts he had collected from the heritage of Jews, let's just say Folker database, respectively. And much of it was done in Ladino. That's we have to point out. He, so he was another key figure, let's just say, of his point in time. So we're exploring the culture a little bit over here. And speak a bit, there was also another famous people. There's a president of the state of Israel once upon a time was Yitzhak Rachmim Navon, if I'm not mistaken. He was the first Sephardic president, or Mizrahi president, we can say. They incorporated in their tefillah, their prayer, the monasterian Jews, hymns recited in notes, I think various notes of Jewish Sephardic version of the Bible, they would actually bring about, especially in Ladino. They're very proud Ladinos. Also, that's something we have to bring about, okay, which is very, very important. Now, yeah, there's another famous person, Nissim Yoshua, I believe his name is, Yosha. He lived between 1933 to 2011. He was a famous historian. He was a calculator, let's just say, of Israel. He was an educator, and he was mechanech, a diploma. He would get a diploma from Israel, also recited by. He really yearned to come to Eretz Israel. This famous rabbi did. He actually, he lived between 1933 till 2011, which is very, very interesting. So Nissim Yosha, I believe, he would be very, very talented, and so on and so forth. Friends, anyone that's tuning in, we're exploring the highlights of the history of Macedonian Jewry here on this special edition of it. So please, everyone, subscribe now to the channel if you are watching actually live. So that's very, very important. And yeah, we're just exploring the history of famous Macedonian. And we spoke about Bosnia. We already spoke about Macedonia, if I'm not mistaken, about the community in of itself. Let's talk a bit about the Beit Knesset Ozer Dalim, the Bitola of Monastir. I think it was formed in 1907 till 1950, if I'm not mistaken. So that's first very interesting thing. There was written documentation of Jewish community would have existed from as early as the 15th century about regarding the Spanish exiles that would actually come and flee the persecution at that stage in time. Community members lived in special, I think, place. I think over there was special houses, I think, for each of the communities, and courtyards of the neighborhood. It was obviously done in Ladino, and it was called by the commonly members El Cortigio, from the courtyards, let's just say. So that's another important. We spoke about the Jamila Kolomolas, and the structure of the synagogue was very, very spectacular, respectively. So, friends, we're exploring the history of Macedonian Jewry. I think this famous Monastir synagogue in Saloniki, I think, and it's an Orthodox Jewish school, this one in Salonika, and very much doing, it was actually designed by Ernest Lowy, I think he lived between 1878 to 1943, and during the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913 and World War I, they established themselves in Saloniki, creating their own congregation over there. The Monasterian people did. Monastir Synagogue, I think, is the last traditional synagogue in Saloniki, in the great tradition of Salonika synagogues, bearing, let's just say, in their names, a place of origins of congregation members over there. That's something we point out. Actually, looking at a list at the moment with regards to it. Second World War, we'll see the synagogues were saved by being requisitioned by the Red Cross. June 1978, the structure of the building was severely damaged by an earthquake, and it was restored, as we said before, by Greek government, and today is used primarily during the high holidays, respectively. So that's very, very interesting. Let's talk a bit more about modern day. What is actually going on? I think, obviously, we talked about the history of the rabbinic structure of Macedonia, the influx of Sephardi community, especially after the Inquisition. The famous rabbis, we speak about Rabbi Shlomo Molcho, who was a famous Portuguese immigrant, a mystic who settled in Monastir during the 1520s. He was a rabbi there. The notable rabbi of Monastir was around the 15th, 16th centuries. Rabbi Shlomo ben Avram HaKohen Maharshach, if I'm not mistaken. Rabbi Yosef ben David Eben Lev, who was a Mahariva. He was a leading rabbi and a religious arbitrator, I think born in 1505, just chronicled over here. So we're just respecting the history of the Jews in North Macedonia, the rich heritage there was at that stage in time, and much more can be said within regards to that period, which I recommend everyone to look into over here. So let's talk about Macedonia, the current rabbinic structure over here. So there's the Bet Yaakov synagogue in Skopje, I think, is the sole functioning synagogue in the entire Macedonia. So that's a very, very interesting community in North Macedonia. A lot can talk about it. It's a central place of Judaism pretty much in Europe, as you can see from upstairs. So that's very interesting. I think currently they have 200 Jews, as we said before, having ties with Belgrade, Serbia, Saloniki. Macedonian Jewry is small, but an active community that's currently experiencing, I think, revival of interest in religious life, according to the World Jewish Congress website. Macedonian Jewish community is represented by the Jewish community in the Republic of Macedonia, Macedonian affiliate of the World Jewish Congress. Interesting enough, so that's very, very interesting. Now, the president, I think, of the school system there is Pepo Levi, which is very, very interesting. So that's something else very important. We talked about how, as the years have evolved with regards to it, I think eventually, much we spoke about. It's interesting, Macedonia currently, I think, has been one of the few countries fully committed to the protection of the property rights of the deported Jews without living heirs, if I'm not mistaken. In 2000, the government passed an heirless property restitution law. To date, the Jewish community of Macedonia is largely centered in Skopje. The reason, yes, that's very interesting. The nation's capital enjoys a sense of stability despite heavy immigration. So that's very important. We spoke about the years of the Holocaust course already. And they estimated that Macedonian Jewish community is numbers between 100 and 300. This is as of 1993, a while ago. And most Macedonian Jews, obviously, I think currently live in Skopje, but some will live in Bitola, also a handful, respectively. Of the community life, I think, despite the small size of the community, just reading the World Jewish Congregation here, high-level organization, the Jewish community of the Republic of Macedonia acts as leading communal group in Macedonian Jewry, encompassing political, social, religious functions for Jews across Macedonia. Macedonian Jewish community is involved in the religion Jewish community and is a member of the European Jewish Congress. Also, Jewish Community Center, I believe there is, serving as a hub, let's just say, of Jewish life in the capital, in Skopje, and so on and so forth, which is something that we have to speak about also. So that's very, very interesting. But we're exploring live the Bet Yaakov synagogue, obviously in Skopje, is the only functioning Jewish synagogue in the country. It was consecrated in the building of the Jewish community in 2000 with the assistance of the Macedonian government, if I'm not mistaken, the joint and the Jewish community of Pasadena. Very interesting, in California. Macedonian Jews maintain close contacts with Jewish communities of Belgrade and Salonika in order to meet religious demands. This is currently Jewish education. Because of the small community, there's no Jewish day schools currently. However, though the Jewish community in Skopje is now able to operate a Sunday school, it's referred to as the Children's Corner. This week's Jewish educator covers the basic tenets of Judaism, including holidays, customs, and traditions, which is very, very interesting. So much more can be said. There's a lot for the youth. I think they try and include between 18 to 26, if I'm not mistaken. There's a Nachman club currently, and the website itself very helpful with the information for visitors and so on and so forth. So that's in the key, let's just say, thing within regards to Macedonian Jewry. Various religious societies and charitable organizations, I believe, we are donating to. We spoke about there's also the famous Chevra Kedisha, if I'm not mistaken. That is very, very interesting. So friends over here, we're exploring the history of Macedonian Jews, rabbinic history also. So it's a very, very, very interesting, informative class of Macedonia, respectively, here on this special edition. A few more tidbits in regards to Macedonia. Let's just talk about the culture and heritage. We've spoken already using the World Jewish Congress and a few other places, but there's a whole rich history with regards to Macedonia Jewish history over here. Especially if you learn about the history of Bulgarian Jewry, also very much complements, I believe, the Macedonian Jewry also respectively. So that is something I urge everyone to actually look into. So that's very interesting. Friends, over here we're exploring the history over here of the Jewish community of Macedonia, of Monastir, Bitola, respectively. The famous rabbis there were, obviously they were connected to Serbia also, and other parts of the old Yugoslavia, and how the synagogues were decorated. That's something also we commemorate every Motzei Shabbat. Which is very interesting. Some of these synagogues were destroyed in the Second World War, if I'm not mistaken also. That's something we have to point out. There's famous Jewish cemetery in Bitola, Monastir, I think it's oldest one, if I'm not mistaken, of those different areas, and it was founded standing, I think. After the destruction of the community in the Holocaust, the cemetery was abandoned, some of its tombstones were broken or stolen, and vegetation grew onto the area. Let's just say the cemetery that was vandalized and heavy damage was caused to its interior. Now, I think after the year 2000 events, the Ministry of Culture of Macedonia declared the cemetery a national site at that point in time. So that's the famous Nukuda, let's just say, with regards to this. So relief societies, charitable organizations that were taking place, especially at the end of the 19th century, operating within the community, and so on and so forth. So that's important to know. In Bitola, there was a community in culture and folklore, as we mentioned about before here on the outset. He was famous, and was especially the son of the rabbi we just spoke about before, and so on and so forth. So very, very interesting. Now, friends, we are a community here. We're learning about famous rabbis and famous happenings of yesteryear. We're exploring the life, let's just say, of the history of rabbis that would be try and make their mark in the various different countries. I think especially in Parshat Noach territory over here. So that's very, very interesting. So, friends, I think we are exploring, as I say, Macedonia, the history of Macedonian Jewry over here, which is always a pleasure to actually record over here and to learn more within regards to the famous places. I think Jerusalem Post actually coined a beautiful article about Macedonian Jewish heritage also, which is something that we have to point out. And that's they're very, very interesting. So we like to explore the history of various different countries, the Jewish communities of different stages of time. So we're speaking, anyone that's joining live now here, please subscribe to the channel. And we're speaking about the history of Macedonian Jewry. We're talking about the famous rabbi. We're talking about Rabbi Samuel de Medina, Rabbi Yosef ben Lev, Rabbi Shlomo Kohn, to name a few. And it's interesting about the houses in Monastir. They are built from wood, making them vulnerable, unfortunately, to fire. So maybe that big fire in 1863 was actually, that was one of the reasons for it. So that's something to talk about. There was, obviously, we spoke about Rabbi Shabtai Dijan, and there was Rabbi Leon Kamaki, who we spoke before, who was very, very Zionistic, and so on and so forth. So we can't speak enough within regards to that, friends. Yes, so here we're just exploring the history of Macedonian Jewry. So I think we got a gist of the history and the culture in itself. And I think we're going to call it a day over here. I hope we encompass the majority of the rabbis. We did speak about 5 or 10 rabbis over here. We tried to speak about the synagogues of Monastir also, which is also very interesting. There's a famous one in Greece, which we spoke about, I think, on the outset. But yeah, that's something we don't necessarily speak about. And as friends, we're a community here. Please join the channel. We are nearing at the moment a staggering 7,500 subscribers, which is an achievement I didn't think we would actually get to at any stage, even when we started, or the starting months, let's just say, in of itself. So that is very, very interesting, and I can't recommend that to enough people over here. Now, not just join the community, you know, be well, enjoy, get inspired, because the whole point is to inspire people and make people great. How important actually is, especially at this day and age where it's a turbulent time all over the world, and a lot of changes, unfortunately, is happening everywhere. I mean, for the better or for the worse, obviously. So that is also very, very important to be aware of over here, friends. And friends, we're a community. Please now subscribe to the channel. We're nearing 7,500 subscribers. If you feel anyone is interested in watching these videos, please share these videos also to other people and help join our community grow further and further, and get more and more inspired, which is very, very important, I think, for the whole of Am Yisrael also. Yes, that is good. And for a special edition here, we've learned the history of Macedonian Jewry over here on this special edition, which is very, very special over here. Now, if you descend from any great rabbis that maybe we've spoken about here on the series, or you feel like we should speak about, please also send me an email with regards to that. I really, really appreciate it. And yeah, it will be a massive feat, as they say, a massive achievement if we can actually get that done, friends, over here. So wishing you all well. Take care. And wishing you all a great night. Thank you for watching and spending the time to be with us. Thank you. I appreciate it.